Keep looking, President Dwyer. Keep looking. You'll find them. It's an honor today to welcome back to the St. Cloud Rotary Club Tom Gillaspy, who has been with us several times in past years. Tom Gillaspy has served as the Minnesota State Department Demographer since 1979. The Demographer is in the Minnesota Department of Administration. Prior to coming to Minnesota, Tom held the position of Demographer at the Andrus Gerontology Center at the University of Southern California. He received his PhD in economics from Pennsylvania State University, specializing in economic demography. He also holds a master's degree in agricultural economics. On a personal side, his wife Kathy was one of the wonderful staff people in the University of Minnesota's Board of Regents office that I've had an opportunity to work with. She also retired. She retired recently and is greatly missed from that office. So Tom, welcome back to St. Cloud Rotary.
Thank you, John. And there are some familiar and friendly faces here today. But for those of you who perhaps have never seen a demographer in the wild before, just a brief definition, it said that we're a lot like accountants, only not quite as exciting. Now that I've lowered your expectation, what I want to do is to talk just a little bit about some of the really big changes that we're seeing in Minnesota and the United States and the world, and maybe connect a couple of the bubbles that you are, a couple of the dots that you're seeing out there right now with all the news about Greece and Italy and France and Japan and things happening all around the world. Try to connect a couple of those dots. First, let me just say that, big surprise. St. Cloud is a growing area, and St. Cloud and Rochester and Moorhead, Fargo. I know over in North Dakota they call it Fargo Moorhead, but I call it Moorhead Fargo. Are the fastest growing metropolitan areas, along with Mankato in Minnesota, and continue to experience fairly strong growth. Minnesota, we kept our 8 congressional seats last decade. Hey, okay, that's good. That's good. And it was close. It was really close. North Carolina is still complaining that we cheated. We just outworked them as usual. Minnesota continues along with South Dakota. Minnesota and South Dakota continue to be the Frost Belt leaders in population growth, as we have every decade since World War II. And well, again, we basically tied in population growth rate, but of course Minnesota added a lot more folks than South Dakota did. But again, Minnesota continues to be a prosperous and growing area. Most of the growth in the United States is occurring in the southeast and southwest portions of the United States. Okay, that brings us up to January of 2008. January 2008, some of you might be familiar with this. The Great Recession began, which is the deepest and longest, most significant economic downturn that we've experienced since the Great Depression. Officially, the recession was over with in July of 2009, but the recovery is going to be slow, it is going to be laborious, it is going to be painful, and the consensus forecast, and this has been the consensus forecast really since the latter part of 2009, is that we will not return to our end of 2007 job level in the United States until about 2013 or 2014. It is a very slow recovery. Of course, you've heard all that in the news, and that continues to be news, but there's a couple of other aspects of this big economic downturn that I want to mention. One is whenever there is a big economic event, excuse me, whenever there's a big economic event, a big recession, the number of babies born declines a bit, and we saw a drop of about 10% below what we had forecasted. That continues to hold. Every hospital, John, you'd be interested in this. Every hospital in Minnesota, I know, and probably in the United States, is wondering when this is going to turn around. And I'm not exactly sure. I think probably next year we'll begin to see some bump upward. We may be seeing some of that bump upward right now, but we will return, and births will rise again. This is a normal kind of thing. It normally happens with a recession, but something that doesn't normally happen is that people quit moving. The number of people moving in the nation really slowed down. Now, remember now, America, since before we were a nation, was characterized by two central tenets, two very important characteristics. One of those is that we are highly mobile. We go to where the opportunities are. And we quit doing that in 2008. We quit doing that. And growth in our fastest growing areas, and in Minnesota that was places like Wright and Sherburne counties, just between here and the Twin Cities. That growth in places like that really began to slow down. Really began to slow down dramatically from about 5 or more percent per year growth down to less than 1% per year growth. People just simply aren't moving. That also happened to the fastest growing states. Places like Florida and Nevada and Arizona and places like that are not growing at the rate that they were in the past. Growth has really slowed down. One of the things that means is that people aren't buying houses, and part of that is that household formation has really slowed down, and a lot of young people have begun to move back in with their folks, with their parents, and this very long-term trend of a downward slide in the average family size has at least temporarily reversed itself, and we're beginning to see a little bit of a rise, a little bit of an increase in the average family size as we have more and more multiple generation families in Minnesota. The households creation, of course, is highly related to housing market, and as you can see from this graph, in 2010 we really went down to a very low level of only about 5,000 households formed, and that corresponded to roughly the same number of housing units. And 2011 was a bit better, but not a lot. It just, about 8,500. That is still, these are still two of the three lowest years that we've had since 1990. And right now, I'm still waiting for the state economist to come up with the next forecast for the next 2 years going out. I suspect that these numbers here for 2012 and 2013 will be ratcheted down some. And so the recovery is very slow and very painful, and this was a very significant economic event. But that's not all that happened in January 2008. And in fact, I believe that 2008 is going to be January 2008 is going to be that separation month between the old way of the old history of America and the new history of America. I mentioned that there are two essential characteristics of America. One is that we are highly mobile. We go to where the opportunities are, and that seems to have ended, at least temporarily, in January of 2008. The other characteristic is that we are young and risk-taking. And that also ended in January of 2008, and that probably will not reverse itself. What happened was that the first wave of the baby boom generation, that really large post-World War II generation, began to turn age 62 and become eligible for old age pension with Social Security in January of 2008, and those same folks began to turn age 65 this last January. Now here's a question that perhaps you can help me with. When did we know that people born in 1946 would turn 65 in 2011. Perhaps a better question is, did we do anything to really prepare for that day? And I think many people would suggest perhaps not so much. That we could have done perhaps more. We knew this was coming. This should not be a surprise, but there are people who seem to be very surprised about this. And this decade, we will add as many people over age 65 in Minnesota and the United States as we have in the last 4 decades combined. And in next decade, we will add even more. And then that big growth of the 65 and older population will be largely over with, but those same people that are turning age 65 this year begin to turn 85 in 20 years. And then we will begin to see a very rapid growth in the 85 and older. We are transitioning right now very rapidly to a very mature society, a very mature economy, and that seems to be an irreversible trend. It's going to be a whole variety of things that are going to begin to change, one of which is households. And for anybody involved in schools right now, this is one of the biggest issues facing you today. I don't mean tomorrow or this week. I mean literally today, because this is, if you didn't go vote, please do. This is election day, and many schools are having various things on their ballots today. Over the next 2 decades, almost all of the growth in households in Minnesota and the United States will be in empty nester households. People whose kids have grown up and moved away, and then moved back, and then moved away, and then moved back. But eventually they do leave, and it's just the 2 of you. And I mean, there's a few familiar faces out here. It's, you know, a couple of you have probably experienced that before. But this represents a real transition in the household, and that connection with the schools is broken. And most households in Minnesota and the United States no longer have a connection back to schools. The only other type of household that's going to really experience a big change this decade is going to be older people living alone. Older single-person households and empty nester couple households. And the nature of housing is expected to change, and change dramatically. We'll also begin to see a rise in certain kinds of disabilities. The first that we will notice will be vision and hearing, and also to some degree ambulatory disabilities. But right now, this decade, this is not the decade of a big rise in disabilities. I know for young people who are champion runners, it's hard to think of somebody being 65 years old that can actually get up and get around, but most of us can. And we will be able to do so for a few more years, God willing. That's not the big change that's going to happen this decade. The big change this decade is not that we're going to become really elderly and senile. The big change this decade is going to be in the labor force. It's going to be in the labor market. And what is happening is this. Something else happened also in spring of 2008, and that is that our high school graduation class peaked and has been declining, and will decline to about the middle of the decade, and will not be back up to that 2008 level till about 2023. So fewer young people available to enter the workforce, a lot of older people getting ready to retire. We are on the verge of an explosion in the number of retirees. And by the end of this decade, our labor force growth will be at record low levels in Minnesota and the United States. Now, this has all sorts of implications. You know, one of those is for job opportunities for young people. And for young people, and I know the young people that are here are not going to have a problem, because you're going to have the technical skills and abilities and things like that that are going to be very marketable. You will do very, very, very well. there will be great opportunities for the people that have saleable skills and abilities. But here is the big thing. This is the big issue facing the United States, facing Europe, facing much of the world right now, is that there's only two ways to grow an economy. Only two ways. Having more Federal Reserve bank notes in your wallet is nice, but that is not one of them. It helps grease the wheels, it helps move commerce more smoothly, but that is not how you grow an economy. There's only two ways to grow an economy. One is to increase the number of people making stuff, and the other is to increase the amount of stuff each person makes. One has to do with the size of the workforce, and we've already dialed this in. That by the end of this decade, we will be at record low levels of growth in our workforce. The only other way is increasing pro-worker productivity. And unless we ramp up substantially over anything that we've experienced in the post-World War II period, unless we substantially ramp up the growth in pro-worker productivity, we will see a slower rate of growth in our workforce. This decade is the beginning of a big transition. We will go from about 5 workers per retiree that we have had over the last several decades, sort of a consistent number. By the end of this decade, that will decline to 4, and by the end of next decade, it will decline to 3 workers per retiree. In countries like Japan, by 2050, it'll be basically 1 worker to 1 retiree. We are going through a massive world shift in the nature of our populations. Minnesota is not an old state. We're not a young state. We are, in fact, the national average. And anything I say about Minnesota is also pretty much true about the nation, at least in terms of the age structure. And we will still see some growth in the workforce by the end of this decade. We will still see some growth. Many of the areas of the world will not. Europe's workforce is declining right now. It is declining. Europe is about 10 years ahead of us in this process, and this is the #1 critical issue. Their economic growth is slower than necessary to pay for the promises that they have made. The promises that they've made in Greece, for example, things like when can you retire and what will your pension be and whether or not you will get health care support. Those are wonderful promises, but the Greek government never booked the promises and never figured out how it was going to pay for them, and that was predicated on the concept of much more rapid economic growth. Greece is now facing a declining workforce. Their workforce is literally getting smaller. They are very much older than we are. They are not pushing up pro-worker productivity. The same thing is happening in Italy, Portugal, Spain. It is also happening in France and England. It's also happening in Germany, but Germany is not facing the same kind of financial issue. Why not? Because Germany has been pushing up pro-worker productivity at a much faster rate than we have in the United States, and radically faster than any of their other European allies. Japan is older than Europe. Japan is about a decade ahead of Europe, about 2 decades ahead of us in this. Japan's workforce has been declining since the late 90s. Their population began to decline a couple years ago, and Japan is one of those things that, because it is now the 3rd largest economy of the world, it used to be the 2nd. It's now the 3rd. China passed them last year. Because it is such a large economy, the stock markets really don't like to talk about this. They talk a lot about Europe, but just wait till they start talking about Japan. China today, the 2nd largest economy of the world, growing very, very rapidly. Gee, if only we could be more like China and grow like China. China is growing very rapidly in part because their workforce is growing rapidly today, but today they are younger than we are. Within 5 years they will be older than us. By 2017, their workforce begins to decline, and by 2027, their population begins to decline. India is at the tipping point of fertility right now that will lead to aging. Mexico is at the tipping point. Brazil is at the tipping point. Chile and Argentina are already beyond this tipping point. Much of the world's population is either aging or is poised at the characteristics that would lead them to an aging population. The only part of the world that is not seeing this aging yet and this trend is sub-Saharan Africa. That is the only part of the world that we have not seen this transition, and that will follow. And this decade, China will add more people over age 65. Remember, this will be a record decade for the United States. China will add more people over 65 than North America, which includes the United States, South America, and Europe combined. The second largest increase will be in India. The world is changing and changing in fundamental and dramatic ways. Basically, what has happened is that we had this old normal, and by normal, think of it as all those little rules of thumb about how the world really works. You know, how much saving, how much do you need to save to pay for retirement? What is your retirement investment return likely to be? How many people do we have to add to the workforce to keep each month, to keep unemployment constant? All these things are changing, and they're changing very, very rapidly, and most people aren't aware that they're changing, and most people are still operating by the old rules of thumb, and you will not after I finish with you today within the next few minutes. So we had all these old rules of thumb, and then the Great Recession came, and then these long-run demographic changes, and now we are entering this new normal. Well, what does this likely mean? And here, the state economist and I talk literally about this almost weekly, and we have for several years, trying to get a better handle on just exactly what do we think is happening here. And this is what we think is going to happen. Now, what we're talking about here is something that has never happened in the history of the world. This is a unique experience in world history. You live in a unique time, and that carries with it certain risk, but it also carries with it great opportunities if you understand what is happening. So this is what we think is likely to happen. One is that economic growth is probably going to slow down. It will certainly slow down unless we push up co-worker productivity, but to keep it at the level that we saw from 1990 to 2008, that's before the recession. From 1990 to 2008, we averaged 2.5% real growth in the United States. To match that level of economic growth, we will have to have a sustained level of per-worker productivity increases larger than anything that we've seen in the post-World War II period for the remainder of this decade. We don't expect that to happen. It's possible, but we don't expect it to happen. And so as a result, economic growth is probably going to slow down. That means your expectations of what kind of returns you're going to have, your expectations of a corporate growth, if you're a CEO or another senior officer in a corporation and your board expects you to grow at the rate that you grew in the 90s and the aughts, you might want to talk to them a little bit about lowering their expectations about what that growth is. You used to say labor is going to be the scarce resource. That's not going to be the scarce resource. We're not talking about warm bodies here. We're talking about talent. People with saleable skills and abilities. This is already the scarce resources. There are literally jobs going begging right now in the midst of high unemployment in Minnesota, because the people looking for a job cannot match the skills and abilities that employers are looking for. The bar is rising. The bar for things like math and science and ability to read things like blueprints and things like that, the bar is rising for all of that, and yet our expectations have not risen with that. And so we are preparing some young people today who will have a very difficult time in the future, but there will be other young people that will be involved in some of these more technical areas, etc., and will have both the soft and hard skills necessary, and they will do very, very, very well. And the returns to education are increasing. People with a bachelor's degree or a graduate degree are earning more than they did in the past. People with a high school diploma or less are earning less. And that difference is increasing and increasing at a fast rate. We are beginning to run into a mismatch that we had anticipated some time ago between skills and abilities in the labor force. There will be a single-minded focus on productivity, not just in the private sector, but also in the public sector. And please, if you are not in the public sector, if you're in the private sector, please expect the public sector to improve its productivity. And if you don't know, if the public sector doesn't seem to know how to do this, encourage them and show them the right way. Public sector really needs to step up to the plate. But there will probably continue to be chronic government deficits and cuts in services. This will not probably go away. There will be increasing worries about how to pay for past promises. This is the issue that Europe is facing today and that China will be facing within 5 years. This is the issue that we are all facing right now. Disruptive events, disruptive innovations will become much more frequent. Be prepared to make sudden and dramatic changes. Watch for what's happening in the world that affects what you do. There will be game changers that will occur that will come unexpectedly. I don't know what they are going to be. Nobody does. That's the thing about disruptors. But be prepared. And there will be a whole new set of grand opportunities. Now, I've mentioned productivity a couple times, and I should probably finish just with this. Productivity is certainly about bigger, faster machines that put people out of work. Yes, that is true. That has always been part of productivity. Would you still want to be making fire with 2 pieces of flint? We have changed. We continue to evolve. This is something that humans have always done. We have always found labor-saving ways of doing things. But that's not the only aspect of productivity that's important. Another aspect of productivity is quality. Making things better. Making things, improving the quality. This is one of the areas that Minnesota has always stood out as an exceptional place. If you need an implantable medical device, you probably, and your life will depend on it, you probably don't want to go to Bob's bargain basement that's made somewhere in the world, half-price stuff put together by who knows where. You probably would prefer to have the best quality made in Minnesota by Minnesotans. And we make about 80% of such devices made in the world. It is truly remarkable. This is one of our great strengths. Quality has always been one of our great strengths. And maybe we should start extending this outside of the private sector and start talking about the public sector, where we improve the high school graduation rate, we improve the quality of our high school graduates. We do things like reducing recidivism rate coming out of prisons and things like that, making major changes in our society, and by improving the quality, also improving productivity. Innovation. I heard the word innovation earlier today, and it really made my heart leap, because that's exactly where we need to be, is being constantly innovative, making better things, doing things better, constantly improving that innovation, and that is also a way to make huge changes in productivity. Basically, we are at a crossroads in our society, physical catch-22, that if we don't make the necessary public investments in human capital, research, and infrastructure, that's education, roads, bridges, general research, then we won't have the productivity gains to make those investments in the future and pay for the promises that we've made. This is not somebody else's problem. This is everybody in this room. This is all our problem. This is all of our issue, and we all need to be part of the solution. There are grand opportunities. There are also grand expenses. So let me just finish with words of a famous Canadian philosopher who also played a little bit of hockey. And for those of you who don't know, Wayne Gretzky scored more goals in professional hockey than anybody else in the history of the sport. And he was one time asked, well, Wayne, how is it that you can score so many goals? And he said, I skate to where the puck will be, not to where it has been. Now there's two aspects to that statement. One is he knows where the puck's going to be. In his mind's eye, he knows where the puck's going to be. And here's the interesting thing. We know where the puck's going to be in 10 years. Most of us tend to age about 1 year every 12 months. It's a pretty regular process. We have a pretty good idea where that puck's going to be in 10 years. We knew in 1946 where the puck was going to be. And we did nothing. We did not skate to it. But here we are. Here we are today. We know where the puck's going to be in 10 years. All we have to do is start moving and skate to that point, act, put our stick on the puck, and score the goal. And if we do that, Minnesota will continue to be one of the most prosperous, growing economies of the world. If we don't, we won't. It's that simple. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. I'm sure you'll be around for questions. And I think there's going to be an emergency meeting of the Lemming Society up on top of the ramp for those of you who are a little worried about what you just heard. John?